I want to go ahead and get to somebody who is a friend of Pix 11 and helps us out in situations like this. JP Tristani, thank you so much for joining us, aviation expert. I'm sorry to say we're talking again not too long from the last time we had something like this happen here in New York. Let's talk about what's going on there.
Yes,
hey there.
And again, very fortunate we don't have any deaths or any multiple injuries or spillage of fuel, and so you count small blessings.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to me about a situation like this when we're dealing with a chopper into a roof there or on a roof there. This is a pretty low ceiling out here right now, and I'm certainly no expert, but would a helicopter have a difficult time in weather like this?
No, helicopters have an avionics suite that make them fully compliant with all instrument flight rules. A pilot would be checked out in it.
Sure.
And so I would assume that it wasn't a pilot that was errantly flying over the city and something happened where he lost situational control.
Sure.
I'm going to assume that there was some fault in the helicopter, and then very fortunate that it appears, from what I see on the reports, that he came down on top of a building rather than going head first into a building,
right,
or he would not have survived. And also, there would be debris falling down on the streets, and I don't see that on any of the film that I'm watching.
So what we're also hearing, police are telling us right now, this was actually a very hard landing. You know, the story is changing. This is a fluid situation. We're hearing it was a very hard landing on a roof, which speaks to what you're saying right now. If this had really been a hard crash there, it would be a very different scene we'd be looking at.
Yes, basically an aircraft. There are no such as the old Pan Am helicopter heliport existing in New York City anymore on any of the buildings. So I'm going to make an assumption that he ran into some kind of trouble, possible engine loss, and in this environment, coming down and landing on top of a building, I can assure you it was a heck of a lot better than going into the building or actually coming down on the street. So again, small blessings for a situation that could have ended up with far more catastrophic results and possible deaths and such as that.
Yeah, well, no question about that at all. Talk about that and talk about the technique or the skill that would be involved in all that, especially on a day like this, especially in the middle of New York City. I mean, we're talking about 787 7th Avenue, which is apparently a high-rise there in Midtown. Talk about having to make a hard landing like that.
Well, again, I'm looking out. I'm in New Jersey, and I'm looking out at an overcast sky and drizzle, and I'm looking at New York City with a fairly good overcast. And so now, in a helicopter, let's say let's assume that he lost an engine, and he decides to auto-rotate down, which is the same as decoupling your engine on your car. You're driving along, and there's something wrong, and suddenly you slip it into neutral. You can steer the car, you can drive it, you can operate the brakes, but there's no power to drive the car, but the engine is still running. So an auto-rotation like that is very standard in any helicopter training. However, when you're in an overcast, such as what I see out there, then that pilot coming down through an overcast and having sufficient time to come down on top of a building is a very good pilot skill. So he was very fortunate that possibly he broke out of the overcast in time to see at least the roof of a building and come down, and a hard landing. Yeah, but there's no smoke and fire, so the hard landing may have just been maybe breaking some of the skids on the bottom of the aircraft, but not breaking it up entirely, because you've got initial reports that the pilot survived, and nobody's rushing up there with ambulances or rather EMT personnel to carry him out.
Well, JP, that is the thing. Those are initial reports right now. We're still trying to confirm that and make sure that is correct. Again, we're getting updates. NYPD advisory. I'm looking at that on Twitter right now, telling people to avoid the area at 51st and 7th Avenue, despite the fact it looks like that this was a hard landing, obviously a crash, and obviously we're still getting details into exactly what happened out there. Are you surprised that you're not seeing more smoke and flames even with a hard landing like that? Because we understand the fire was extinguished.
Fuel, And of course, unless he ruptured a fuel cell, you would not see any accompanying fire and smoke. And a good pilot who's perfectly cognizant, functional, and has the ability that he even makes a hard landing, because if he did an auto rotation, the principal part of an auto rotation is doing a flare. In other words, stopping that rate of descent and forward airspeed that are necessary. So that's a high degree of skill, and coming down out of an overcast is not an enviable position for a pilot. So the hard landing, as long as he didn't break the fuel cells and shut the engine down immediately upon whatever his arrival can term to be, a hard landing or a crash, then you would not get any fire and smoke, or that the blades were not sheared, because if you have a blade shear from hitting a building or hitting an obstruction, that blade with its rotation, I've seen helicopter blades be tossed for a mile, and they're very lethal. So I don't see that in your film, and I don't see in your video. And so you're, again, very fortunate, both for the pilot and all of the people in the surrounding that building and on the streets. Yeah,
well, no question about that at all. Let me ask you something, and we've talked about this a lot, and each one of these has a different situation, different circumstances around it. But this is the second helicopter crash now that we've seen in a very short amount of time, here in New York City. I'm trying to think. I think it's just in the past several weeks or so, because you and I have talked a few different times. What does that say to you? Does that concern you?
Not really. Again, some people would say, well, I don't believe in coincidence. This is a coincidence. If you go around through the United States, there are crashes literally, through the world, there are crashes every day. That it happens in such a short time from our last discussion of that Hero crash again into the Hudson River. Again, you have this other one here. No, it just tells me, though, that if he were flying in a Hudson corridor and found himself over the city, that could be a pilot error, and of course you're exposing a chopper and the people below you to a high degree of danger. But no, I don't think it's a trend line. I just think it just happens to be an unfortunate series of two events.
So, JP, I am hearing that there was an actual fire upon impact there, that the FDNY was able to get out. So that does really just kind of emphasize what kind of hard landing we're talking about.
Oh, yeah. Again, if you're not able to do a sufficient flare to break that rate of descent, you're not coming down at a normal, for instance, a fixed-wing aircraft touchdown of 300 feet, 200 feet per second. In a helicopter auto rotation, you're coming down very rapidly, and it's imperative that at that 100-foot point, you go into a flare. Now, he may not have had that time. He may have seen that building coming out of this overcast, executed what flare he could do, pull back on that collective as hard as he could to get the rate of descent dropped, and then he hits. And there could have also been a fire because there's usually a lot of mechanicals on the top of these buildings, air conditioning systems.